The rain came down hard that Tuesday night, turning the parking lot into a mirror of blurry streetlights. David Chen pulled his car into the last spot at Roy's Diner, a small place off Highway 9 that looked like it had been there since the 70s. The neon sign flickered above the door, half the letters dark, spelling out something that might have been the restaurant's name. He was tired. Bone tired, the kind of exhausted that comes from living two lives at once. For the past 3 weeks, he'd been driving through small towns, staying in cheap motels, eating at places where nobody knew his face. He needed this. Needed to feel normal again, even if just for a little while. Inside the diner, the smell of coffee and fried food hit him immediately. It was warm, a welcome change from the cold rain outside. The place was nearly empty. An elderly couple sat near the window, sharing a piece of pie. A trucker hunched over the counter, working through a plate of eggs. The waitress looked bored, refilling salt shakers behind the counter. David took the corner booth in the back, sliding into the worn vinyl seat. He ordered coffee, black, and told the waitress he needed a few minutes before ordering food. She nodded and left him alone. This was what he wanted. Silence. Space. A chance to be just another face in a forgotten diner. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages he'd been ignoring. His assistant had called 4 times. His chief of staff had sent a dozen emails. There was a meeting he was supposed to attend tomorrow, something about budget allocations and policy reviews. He felt the familiar weight pressing down on his shoulders and turned the phone face down on the table. That's when she walked in. The woman looked to be in her mid-50s, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore a nurse's scrubs under a raincoat that dripped water onto the floor. Her eyes were puffy and red. She'd been crying, that much was obvious. She stood at the entrance for a moment, looking around the diner like she was searching for something she couldn't quite name. Then she walked straight to his booth. "Is anyone sitting here?" she asked, her voice shaky. David looked up at her. He could see the tremor in her hands, the way she was holding herself together by sheer will. Every instinct told him to say yes to protect his solitude, but something in her expression stopped him. He recognized that look, desperation, the kind that comes when you're drowning and looking for anything to hold on to. "No," he said quietly. "Go ahead." She slid into the seat across from him, not bothering to take off her wet coat. For a moment, she just sat there staring at the table. The waitress came over and the woman ordered tea. Her hands were shaking so badly that David wasn't sure she'd be able to hold the cup. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, looking up at him. "I know this is weird, sitting with a complete stranger, but everywhere else was full and I couldn't sit alone right now." I couldn't, that wasn't true. The diner was practically empty. But David understood. Sometimes you needed a lie to justify reaching out. Sometimes admitting you needed another human being was too hard without one. "It's okay," he said simply. She looked at him then, really looked at him, searching his face for something. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she let out a long breath, and her shoulders sagged. "Thank you," she whispered. The waitress brought the tea. The woman wrapped her hands around the cup like it was the only warm thing left in the world. David went back to his coffee, giving her space. He wasn't going to push. If she wanted to talk, she would. If she wanted to sit in silence, that was fine too. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The rain kept hammering against the windows. The trucker at the counter paid his bill and left. The elderly couple shuffled out, the man holding the door for his wife. The diner felt even emptier now, like they were the only 2 people left in the world. "His name was Jamie," she said suddenly. David looked up but didn't say anything. He just listened. "My son. His name was Jamie. He was 23. She paused, her voice catching. 6 months ago today, actually. 6 months since the accident." The words hung in the air between them. David felt his chest tighten, but he kept his face neutral. He'd learned over the years how to listen without reacting, how to let people talk without making it about himself. He was driving to the city. She continued, her eyes focused on something far away. Had a meeting at some recording studio. He was a musician, guitar mostly. He could play anything, though. Piano, drums, even the violin. He taught himself when he was 12, can you believe that? Just picked up a guitar at a yard sale and figured it out. A small smile crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He'd been trying to make it for years. Playing bars, coffee shops, anywhere that would let him. He worked at a warehouse during the day to pay bills, played music at night. Never gave up. And then finally, he got his break. This producer wanted to meet him. Said Jamie had something special. Said he could help him make a real album. She took a sip of her tea, wincing like it burned. He never made it to that meeting. Some driver ran a red light going 60 in a 35 zone. Hit Jamie's car on the driver's side. Killed him instantly, they said. That's what the police told me. Instantly, like that's supposed to make it better. Like knowing he didn't suffer makes up for the fact that he's gone. David felt something crack inside his chest. He'd heard stories like this before, read reports, seen statistics. But this was different. This was real. This was a mother sitting across from him in a dying diner, holding onto a cup of tea like it was all she had left. The driver didn't stop, she said, her voice harder now. Just kept going. Left my son there in the middle of the road and drove away like his life didn't matter. Like 23 years of existence could just be erased and forgotten. She looked up at David then, her eyes filled with a pain so deep he could feel it across the table. The police tried to find them. They really did at first, but there were no cameras on that street. No witnesses who saw the car clearly, just tire marks and broken glass and my son's blood on the pavement. Her voice broke on the last word, and she covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. David sat there, not moving, giving her space to fall apart. He didn't reach across the table to pat her hand. He didn't offer empty words about time healing wounds or everything happening for a reason. He just sat there, present, witnessing her pain without trying to fix it. Because some things can't be fixed. Some grief is too big for comfort. Sometimes the only thing you can offer another person is your attention, your silence, your willingness to sit with them in their darkness without running away. After a few minutes, she wiped her eyes and looked up at him again. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to dump all of this on you. You probably think I'm crazy. No, David said quietly. I think you're a mother who lost her son, and I think you needed someone to listen. She stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. You have kind eyes, she said finally. Jamie would have liked you. David didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. He signaled the waitress for more coffee, and they sat there together as the rain continued to fall. Two strangers sharing space in a forgotten diner, connected by nothing more than a moment of human need and the willingness to acknowledge it. Catherine ordered another cup of tea, and David got a refill on his coffee. Neither of them had touched the menus. Food seemed beside the point now. The diner had become something else entirely. A confessional, a safe space carved out of the ordinary world where strangers could speak truths they couldn't say anywhere else. Can I show you something? Catherine asked, pulling her phone from her coat pocket. Her hands were steadier now, like talking about Jamie had given her a kind of purpose. Of course, David said. She scrolled through her photos, then turned the screen toward him. A young man with dark curly hair smiled back at the camera, holding a guitar that looked older than he was. He had his mother's eyes, warm and expressive. In the photo, he was mid-laugh, like someone had just told him the world's best joke. That was taken 2 weeks before the accident, Catherine said softly. At his last gig, this little bar in Oakland called the Rusty Nail. 30 people showed up. He played for 2 hours straight, didn't even take a break. Afterwards, he told me it was the best night of his life. She swiped to another photo. Jamie at what looked like a high school graduation, cap crooked on his head. Another one of him as a kid, missing his front teeth holding up a participation trophy. Then one of him serious, focused, fingers pressed against guitar strings in some kind of practice session. He practiced every single day, Catherine continued, even when he was exhausted from work, even when he could barely keep his eyes open. He'd play for at least an hour. Said it was like breathing, something he had to do to stay alive. David studied each photo carefully. There was something about seeing Jamie's face that made the story real in a way words couldn't. This wasn't just a tragedy or a statistic. This was a whole person, someone with dreams and talents and a mother who loved him more than anything in the world. The producer who wanted to meet him. David said carefully, Did you ever speak with him after? Catherine nodded, her expression darkening. Yeah. Guy named Vincent Reyes. He called me 3 days after the funeral. Said he was sorry for my loss. Said Jamie had real talent, that he'd been excited to work with him. She paused, staring into her tea. Then he said something that stuck with me. He said, "Your son was one call away from changing his life. One meeting. That's all it would have taken." The weight of those words settled over the table. One meeting. One moment that would never happen. A future erased by someone's carelessness and cowardice. "The worst part isn't just that he's gone," Catherine said, her voice getting tighter. "It's that someone out there knows what they did. They know they killed my son. They woke up the next morning and decided to just keep living their life like nothing happened. Like Jamie's death was just an inconvenience, something to cover up and forget about." David felt anger stirring in his chest, the kind that came from witnessing injustice up close. He'd spent years dealing with cases and files and reports, but this was different. This was sitting across from the human cost of failure, seeing what happened when the system let people down. "What did the police say?" he asked. "When the investigation stalled?" Catherine let out a bitter laugh. "They said they'd done everything they could. No cameras, no witnesses, no DNA evidence left at the scene. The other driver's car probably had damage, but without knowing what kind of vehicle to look for, they couldn't track it down. They told me cold cases sometimes get solved years later, that I shouldn't give up hope. But I could see it in their eyes. They'd already moved on." She pulled out a worn folder from her purse, setting it on the table between them. Inside were police reports, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. David recognized the look of it immediately. This was the work of someone who refused to let go, who turned grief into determination. "I hired a private investigator," Catherine said. "Used money from Jamie's savings account, the money he'd been putting aside for recording his album. Felt wrong spending it, but I thought maybe this guy could find something the police missed." "Did he?" "He tried. Spent 2 months on it. Interviewed people who lived near the intersection. Checked body shops for cars that came in with front-end damage around that time. Even looked through traffic camera footage from surrounding streets to see if he could spot any vehicles heading away from the area." She closed the folder slowly. "Nothing. It was like whoever did this just vanished into thin air." David leaned back in the booth thinking. Something about this didn't add up. Hit and runs were difficult to solve, but not impossible. There were usually threads to pull, leads to follow. The fact that everything had come up completely empty felt wrong. "How much did the investigator charge you?" he asked. $3,500. "Everything I had left in Jamie's account," David nodded slowly. He'd seen enough cases to know that some private investigators were legitimate professionals, while others were just good at taking money from desperate people. But he kept that thought to himself. "There's something else," Catherine said, hesitating. The investigator mentioned something before he closed the case. Said he'd tried to talk to one witness, a woman who lived in the house on the corner. She'd given a statement to police right after the accident. Said she'd heard the crash but didn't see the car. When he went to talk to her again, she refused to open the door. Then a few days later she called him and said if he came back she'd call the police. "That's odd," David said carefully. "That's what I thought. But the investigator said sometimes people just don't want to get involved. Said maybe she was scared or maybe she just didn't want to relive it." Catherine's hands tightened around her cup. "But I keep thinking, what if she saw something? What if someone told her to keep quiet?" The diner seemed quieter now, like the world outside had stopped. David felt the familiar pull of a puzzle, the sense that there was more to this story than what appeared on the surface. His mind was already working through possibilities, scenarios, questions that needed answering. "Did the investigator get the witness's name?" he asked. "Helen Morris. Lives at 247 Oak Street, right at the intersection where it happened." David made a mental note of it, though he wasn't sure yet what he'd do with the information. This wasn't his case. He wasn't even supposed to be here, sitting in this diner, getting involved in a stranger's tragedy. But something had shifted inside him during this conversation, something that made walking away feel impossible. "I dream about it sometimes," Catherine said quietly. "About finding the person who did this. About looking them in the eye and asking them why they didn't stop. Why my son's life wasn't worth a phone call to 911. Why they thought they could just drive away and face no consequences." She looked up at David and he saw something in her eyes that went beyond grief. It was a kind of exhaustion that came from carrying an impossible weight for too long, from fighting a battle you couldn't win alone. "The system failed my son twice," she said. "Once when someone killed him and drove away, and again when everyone decided he wasn't worth the effort to find justice for, and I can't do anything about it. I'm just a nurse from a small town. I don't have connections or money or power. I have a folder full of dead ends and a heart that won't stop breaking. David reached across the table and placed his hand over hers just for a moment. It was the first real physical contact they'd had all night, and it felt significant somehow. A promise made without words. Your son mattered, David said firmly. Jamie mattered. And what happened to him was wrong. You're right to be angry. You're right to want answers. Catherine's eyes filled with tears again. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know how much it means just to have someone say that. To have someone believe that this matters, but David did know. Because in that moment, he'd made a decision. He didn't know yet how he'd do it or what it would cost, but he was going to help her. He was going to find out what really happened to Jamie and why the investigation had gone nowhere. He just couldn't tell her that yet. Not until he knew whether he could actually deliver. They sat in that booth for another 40 minutes, talking about Jamie in the way that only happens when grief needs a witness. Catherine told David about the time Jamie was 8 and decided to start a neighborhood band with kids who couldn't play any instruments. How he'd been the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday. How he'd called her every Sunday without fail, even when he was busy, even when he had nothing special to say. He was a good son, she said simply. The kind of man who'd stop to help someone change a tire in the rain, who'd give his last $20 to someone who needed it more, and now he's gone. And the person who killed him gets to keep living like none of it matters. David absorbed every word, every detail. He wasn't just listening anymore. He was building a picture in his mind, mapping out connections and possibilities. Years of training had taught him how to find patterns, how to see what others missed. And something about Catherine's story wasn't sitting right with him. The witness who suddenly refused to talk. The investigation that went cold so quickly. The complete absence of any leads despite a major accident on a residential street. Either this was a case of terrible luck, or something else was going on. Finally, the waitress came over and told them the diner would be closing in 15 minutes. David looked at his watch and was surprised to see it was almost midnight. Time had disappeared while they'd been talking, the way it does when you're fully present with another person. Catherine gathered her things, stuffing the folder back into her purse. I should let you go, she said, standing up. You've been so kind to sit here and listen to me talk about my problems. Most people don't want to hear it anymore. They think I should be over it by now. 6 months isn't very long, David said, standing as well. Grief doesn't work on a schedule. She smiled at him, a real smile this time, small but genuine. You're a good person, she said. I can tell. Jamie would have liked you. He had a sense about people, could always tell who was real and who was just pretending. David felt something twist in his chest. If she knew who he really was, would she still think that? Would she still see him as someone Jamie would have liked? He'd spent so long living behind titles and responsibilities that he wasn't sure anymore where the job ended and the real person began. Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, one of those generic ones you can print at home. It had her name, phone number, and email address. Nothing else. She handed it to David, and he took it carefully like it was something precious. I know this is strange, she said, giving my number to someone I just met, but you listened tonight in a way that felt important, and I just wanted to say, if you're ever in a position to help someone who's been wronged, someone who's fallen through the cracks of the system, I hope you'll remember my Jamie. I hope you'll remember that these aren't just cases or files or statistics. They're people with families who love them. David looked at the card, then at Catherine. In that moment, he wanted to tell her everything. Wanted to say that he wasn't just some random guy in a diner, that he actually had the power to help her, that he could reopen her son's case with a single phone call. But something held him back. Maybe it was caution. Maybe it was fear of making a promise he couldn't keep. I'll remember, he said instead. I promise you that. Catherine nodded, satisfied with that answer. She pulled on her raincoat and picked up her purse. Thank you, she said one more time. For everything. For listening. For caring. For making me feel like Jamie's life mattered to someone other than me. It did matter, David said firmly. It does matter. She walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. I didn't even ask your name, she said. David hesitated for just a second. David, he said. Well, David, I hope life treats you kindly. You deserve it. Then she was gone, disappearing into the rain and the darkness beyond the diner's windows. David stood there for a moment watching her taillights fade down the highway. The waitress was wiping down tables. shooting him looks that said it was time to leave. He paid his bill, left a generous tip, and walked out to his car. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and the parking lot was empty except for his vehicle and the waitress's beat-up sedan. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, not starting the engine, just thinking. David pulled out his phone and looked at the business card Catherine had given him. Then he opened his wallet and carefully tucked the card inside, next to his driver's license and credit cards, right where he'd see it every day. For years, he'd told himself that his work was about the bigger picture. Policy changes that helped thousands of people, legal reforms that improved the system. He'd convinced himself that individual cases were for other people to handle, that his job was to think strategically, to see the forest instead of the trees. But sitting in that diner, listening to Catherine talk about her son, David had felt something shift inside him. He'd remembered why he'd gotten into this line of work in the first place. Not for the power or the prestige or the ability to shape policy, but because he'd believed once upon a time that the system should work for everyone. That justice wasn't just for people with money and connections. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of that. He'd become comfortable, isolated, removed from the real consequences of the decisions he made. He'd forgotten what it felt like to look someone in the eye and see their pain, their hope, their desperate need for someone to give a damn. But he remembered now. David started the car and pulled out of the parking lot. Instead of heading back to his hotel, he drove around for a while, thinking through the logistics of what he was about to do. This wasn't going to be simple. Reopening a cold case, especially one that had been closed for months, would raise questions. He'd need to be careful, strategic, to make sure he didn't tip off anyone who might have an interest in keeping Jamie's case buried, because that's what this felt like. Not just a case that had gone cold, but one that had been deliberately put on ice. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. That witness who'd suddenly refused to talk. The investigation that had stalled so quickly despite what should have been multiple leads to follow. Someone had wanted this case to disappear. The question was why. David pulled over at a gas station and took out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. Rita Alvarez, his chief of staff. She'd worked with him for 7 years and he trusted her completely. If anyone could help him look into this quietly, it was her. But it was midnight, too late to call. This would have to wait until morning. He sent her a text instead, brief and to the point. Need you to pull some files for me first thing tomorrow. Hit-and-run case from 6 months ago. Victim's name was Jamie Porter. Discreet. Will explain in person. The message delivered, and David put his phone away. He felt more awake now than he had in months, energized by a sense of purpose he'd almost forgotten existed. This was going to be complicated. He'd probably face pushback from his own staff, from police departments who didn't like their closed cases being questioned, maybe even from people who had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. But David didn't care. He'd made a promise to Catherine, even if she didn't fully understand what that promise meant. He'd told her he'd remember Jamie, that he'd remember these were people and not just statistics, and he intended to keep that promise no matter what it cost him. He drove back to his hotel, his mind already working through the next steps. Tomorrow he'd start asking questions. He'd dig into the case file, find out who'd been assigned to the investigation, look for the holes and inconsistencies that would tell him what really happened. Catherine had trusted a stranger with her grief, with her son's memory, with her desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might care enough to help. David wasn't going to let her down. As he lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, he thought about Jamie, about a young musician who'd never got to make his album, never got to fulfill his dreams, never got to become the person he was meant to be. About a mother sitting alone in a diner carrying a folder full of dead ends and a heart full of grief. And David made himself a second promise. He was going to find out who killed Jamie Porter, and he was going to make sure they faced justice no matter who they were or who was protecting them. The rain had stopped by the time he finally fell asleep, but David barely noticed. He was already planning his next move. David woke up at 6 in the morning with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He showered, got dressed, and was sitting in a coffee shop by 7, reviewing everything Catherine had told him the night before. He'd written down every detail he could remember, filling 3 pages in his notebook with names, dates, and questions that needed answers. By 8:30, He was walking into his office building. Rita was already there, which didn't surprise him. She was always the first one in and the last one out. When he entered her office, she looked up from her computer with the expression of someone who knew something unusual was coming. "So," she said, closing her laptop. "Jamie Porter, want to tell me why the Attorney General is personally interested in a 6-month-old hit-and-run case?" David closed the door behind him and sat down. Rita was more than his chief of staff. She was his conscience, the person who told him when he was making a mistake or when something didn't smell right. If he was going to do this, he needed her on board. "I met his mother last night," David said simply, "in a diner. She told me her story." Rita raised an eyebrow. "You met a random woman in a diner and now you want to reopen her son's case?" "David, you know how this looks. We have protocols for a reason." "I know, but there's something wrong with this case. The investigation went cold too fast. There's a witness who suddenly refused to cooperate. It feels like someone wanted this buried." Rita leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Or it's just a tragic accident that went unsolved because that's what happens sometimes. Not every case has a conspiracy behind it. I know that too, but I need to at least look. If I'm wrong, if there's nothing there, then I'll drop it. But if I'm right..." He trailed off, thinking about Catherine's face, about the folder of dead ends she'd shown him. "If you're right, you're going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable," Rita finished, "including possibly some people in law enforcement who don't like being second-guessed. Can you pull the file or not?" Rita sighed, but she was already reaching for her phone. "Give me 2 hours." "And David? Be careful with this. I've seen good people destroy their careers over cases that got personal." David left her office and spent the next 2 hours in meetings he could barely focus on. Budget discussions, policy reviews, updates on ongoing cases. His mind kept drifting back to the diner, to Catherine's words. Someone out there knows what they did. At 11, Rita appeared in his doorway and nodded. He followed her back to her office, where a thick folder sat on her desk. She'd worked fast, pulling not just the police reports but also witness statements, crime scene photos, and the investigators' notes. David spent the next 3 hours going through everything. The accident had happened at the intersection of Oak Street and Porter Avenue, around 7 in the evening. Jamie had been driving home from work, planning to drop off his guitar before heading to the recording studio meeting. According to the reconstruction, the other vehicle had run a red light at high speed, T-boning Jamie's car on the driver's side. The impact had been fatal almost instantly, but here's where things got interesting. The police had found paint transfer on Jamie's car, dark blue metallic. They'd identified it as coming from a luxury vehicle, probably a BMW or Mercedes. That should have narrowed things down significantly. How many dark blue luxury cars could there be in a small town? David flipped through the witness statements. Most were useless. People who'd heard the crash but hadn't seen it. A couple who'd arrived on scene minutes later but had no information about the other vehicle. And then there was Helen Morris, the woman Catherine's investigator had mentioned. Helen's initial statement was brief. She'd been in her kitchen when she heard the crash. By the time she got to her window, the other car was already driving away. She couldn't see what kind of vehicle it was, couldn't make out the license plate, just saw taillights disappearing down Oak Street. But there was a note attached to her statement written by the investigating officer. Witness seemed nervous, kept looking at her phone. When asked if she was expecting a call, she said no, and ended the interview quickly. Recommend follow-up. That follow-up never happened. Or if it did, there was no record of it in the file. David kept reading. The case had been assigned to Detective Frank Carlson, a 20-year veteran with a solid record. Carlson had pursued several leads in the first week. He'd contacted body shops within a 50-mile radius, asking them to report any dark blue luxury vehicles that came in with front-end damage. He'd reviewed traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, trying to track vehicles leaving the area. He'd even checked with local BMW and Mercedes dealerships for recent repairs. Nothing. Every lead hit a dead end. Then, 2 weeks into the investigation, something changed. The notes became shorter, less detailed. Carlson stopped pursuing new leads. 3 weeks after Jamie's death, the case was officially classified as cold and moved to inactive status. No explanation given. David sat back in his chair thinking, this wasn't right. Carlson was a good detective with a strong track record. He wouldn't have given up this easily unless someone had told him to back off. He picked up his phone and called Rita. I need you to set up a meeting with Detective Frank Carlson. Don't tell him what it's about, just say I want to consult with him on an old case. And Rita, make sure it's off the record. The meeting was set for the following morning at a coffee shop downtown, away from police headquarters. David spent the rest of the day and most of the evening preparing. He knew he'd only get one shot at this. If Carlson felt threatened or ambushed, he'd shut down. The next morning, David arrived early and took a table in the back corner. Carlson showed up exactly on time, a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes. He looked around the coffee shop, clearly puzzled about why the state's attorney general wanted to meet him in such an informal setting. "Mr. Chen," Carlson said, shaking David's hand, "I have to admit your assistant was pretty mysterious about what this is regarding. Please sit down. Can I get you coffee?" They made small talk for a few minutes while they waited for their drinks. Then David opened the folder he'd brought with him and slid it across the table. "I want to talk to you about the Jamie Porter case." Carlson's expression changed immediately. Something flickered in his eyes there and gone so fast David almost missed it. Fear, anger, resignation. "That case went cold," Carlson said carefully. "We pursued every lead we had. Sometimes that's just how it goes. You're a good detective, Frank, one of the best. 20 years on the force, dozens of solved cases. So I'm having trouble understanding how this one got away from you so completely." Carlson looked down at his coffee. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me what really happened. Why did the investigation stop so suddenly? Why didn't you follow up with Helen Morris after your initial interview? Why didn't you pursue the paint transfer evidence more aggressively?" The silence stretched out between them. David could see Carlson wrestling with something, some internal battle between loyalty and conscience. "Off the record?" Carlson finally asked. "Completely." Carlson took a deep breath. "I got a call 3 weeks into the investigation. From my captain. He said I needed to let the Porter case go cold. Said we had more pressing cases that needed my attention. I pushed back, told him we had solid leads, that with a little more time I could crack it. He told me it wasn't a suggestion." David felt his pulse quicken. "Did he say why?" "No, but I did some digging on my own time. Quiet-like, nothing official. Found out that the witness, Helen Morris, she has a brother, guy named Thomas Morris. He's a judge in the county circuit court. And you think Judge Morris was involved? I think his nephew was involved. Kid named Brett Morris, 22 years old. Spoiled rich kid with a history of speeding tickets and DUIs, all of which mysteriously got dismissed. Drives a dark blue BMW. Or at least he did until about 3 weeks after the accident when suddenly he traded it in for a different vehicle." David felt everything click into place. "You tried to pursue this." "I went to my captain with what I'd found. Told him we needed to bring Brett Morris in for questioning. Examine his old vehicle if we could track it down. That's when my captain pulled me into his office and told me in no uncertain terms that I was to drop it. Said Judge Morris was a pillar of the community, that his family had connections, and that accusing his nephew without solid evidence would end my career. So you dropped it." Carlson looked David straight in the eye. "I have a wife and 2 kids in college. I'm 4 years from retirement. Yeah, I dropped it. And I've felt sick about it every day since." He paused. "That mother deserves to know what happened to her son. But I couldn't do anything about it. Not without throwing away everything I've worked for." David understood. He didn't like it, but he understood. This was how corruption worked. Not with dramatic bribes or threats, but with quiet pressure on good people who had too much to lose. "What if I told you that you could help now?" David said. "That I could protect you, make sure your career stays intact while we finally get justice for Jamie Porter?" Carlson looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "You'd do that? Go after a sitting judge and his family? If they're guilty, yes. But I need your help. I need everything you found, everything you suspected. And I need you to be willing to testify if it comes to that." Carlson was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. "I kept copies of everything. My notes, my leads, all the evidence I gathered before being told to stop. I kept telling myself that someday someone would care enough to look into it." He slid the drive across the table. "I guess that day is today." David took the flash drive, feeling its weight in his hand. This was it. This was what he needed to finally get Catherine the answer she deserved. David spent the next 2 weeks building his case. The flash drive Carlson had given him was a gold mine. Photos of Brett Morris's BMW taken weeks after the accident, showing fresh paint and bodywork. Cell phone records placing Brett near the intersection at the time of the crash. Witness statements that had never made it into the official file. Even security footage from a gas station 3 blocks away showing a dark blue BMW speeding through a red light minutes before the accident. It was all there. Everything they needed to prove Brett Morris had killed Jamie Porter, and his uncle, Judge Thomas Morris, had used his influence to bury the investigation. But David knew he had to be careful. Going after a sitting judge was dangerous territory. One wrong move and the whole case could fall apart. He brought in the state police, then quietly contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. This wasn't just about a hit and run anymore. This was about obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and a broken system that protected the wealthy and connected while leaving families like Catherine's with nothing. On a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after meeting Catherine in the diner, David gave the order. State police arrested Brett Morris at his apartment. FBI agents showed up at Judge Morris's chambers with a warrant. The captain who'd ordered Carlson to drop the case was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The media picked up the story within hours. Attorney General personally oversees arrest in cold case hit and run. Prominent judge accused of obstructing justice to protect nephew. The headlines were everywhere. But before any of that became public, before the press conference and the media circus, David had something important to do. He drove to Catherine's house, a small place on the edge of town with a garden out front that looked like it had been neglected for months. The grass was too long, weeds growing through the flower beds. He understood. When you lose someone you love, things like yard work stop mattering. David stood on the porch for a moment, his heart pounding. He'd rehearsed what he was going to say 100 times, but now that he was here, all those words felt inadequate. How do you tell a mother that you've found the person who killed her son? How do you explain that justice was denied not because the case was unsolvable, but because powerful people had actively worked to cover it up? He knocked on the door. Catherine answered after a moment, and her face showed complete confusion. She was wearing scrubs again, like she'd just gotten home from a shift. Her eyes were tired, dark circles underneath them. She looked at David like she was trying to place him, like maybe she'd seen him somewhere but couldn't quite remember where. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Catherine, it's me, David, from the diner 3 weeks ago." Recognition dawned slowly, followed by surprise. "David, what are you doing here?" "How did you even know where I lived?"
Can I come in?
"I have something important to tell you." She hesitated, clearly uncertain, but something in his expression must have convinced her because she stepped aside and let him in. The house was small but clean, filled with photos of Jamie at every age. His presence was everywhere. His guitar sat on a stand in the corner. His high school diploma hung on the wall. This wasn't just a house. It was a shrine to a life cut short. They sat in the living room and Catherine waited, her hands folded in her lap. David could see the hope in her eyes mixed with fear. Hope that maybe something had changed. Fear that this was just another dead end. "Catherine, I need to tell you something, and I should have told you that night in the diner, but I wasn't sure if I could help and I didn't want to make promises I couldn't keep." "What are you talking about?" David took a deep breath. "My full name is David Chen. I'm the state's Attorney General." Catherine's hands flew to her mouth. She stared at him like he'd just told her he was from another planet. "You're what?" "The Attorney General. But you were just some guy in a diner. I was taking a break from my life, trying to feel normal for a while. And then you sat down across from me and you told me about Jamie and everything changed. I don't understand. Your son's case has been reopened. We've identified the person who killed him. His name is Brett Morris. He's 22 years old and he was driving under the influence when he ran that red light and hit Jamie's car. Then he fled the scene and his uncle, a judge, used his influence to make sure the investigation went nowhere." Catherine's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, grief, all of it crashing over her in waves. "You found him? You actually found the person who killed my son?" "We did. Brett Morris was arrested this morning. So was his uncle, Judge Thomas Morris, for obstruction of justice. The police captain who ordered the investigation shut down is being investigated as well. The FBI is involved now. These people are going to face serious consequences for what they did." Tears started streaming down Catherine's face, but she wasn't making a sound. She just sat there crying silently, her whole body shaking. David wanted to reach out to her, to offer comfort, but he knew she needed space to process this. "Why?" she finally whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" "For Jamie?" "Because you were right," David said. "These aren't just cases or files or statistics. They're people. They're someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend, and the system failed Jamie twice. Once when Brett Morris hit his car and drove away, and again when people who were supposed to seek justice decided to protect a judge's reputation instead. I couldn't let that stand." Catherine wiped her eyes, looking at David with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That night in the diner when I told you about Jamie, you just listened. You didn't tell me who you were or what you could do. You just sat there and listened like I mattered. You did matter. You do matter. I gave you my card. I told you if you were ever in a position to help someone who'd been wronged, to remember Jamie." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, "And you were already in that position. You were already someone who could help. But you didn't tell me why." David thought about how to answer that. "Because I wasn't sure yet if I could deliver. And I didn't want to give you hope just to take it away if I was wrong. I needed to know first if there was really something there, if justice was actually possible." Catherine stood up and walked over to the guitar in the corner. She ran her fingers along the strings and they made a soft, discordant sound. "Jamie saved up for 2 years to buy this guitar. Worked double shifts at the warehouse. Gave up going out with friends, ate ramen for dinner most nights. When he finally had enough money, he went to this music shop downtown and spent 3 hours trying out different guitars until he found the right one." She turned to look at David. "He had dreams, big, impossible dreams. He wanted to make music that mattered, music that made people feel something. He wanted to tour the world, play in stadiums, write songs that would outlive him, and some drunk kid took all of that away in a single moment of carelessness, then had the nerve to just drive away like Jamie's life meant nothing. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry it took so long to get here. I'm sorry the system failed your family. I'm sorry that people who should have fought for justice decided to protect their own interests instead." Catherine came back and sat down next to David. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for listening that night. Thank you for caring when you didn't have to. Thank you for remembering that my son was a person and not just another cold case. There's going to be a press conference this afternoon," David said gently. "I wanted you to hear about the arrests from me first before it becomes a media circus. But Catherine, I need you to know something. This is going to get intense. There will be reporters, questions, cameras. Judge Morris has powerful friends who are going to try to discredit the case and protect him. It's not going to be easy." "I don't care," Catherine said firmly. "Let them come. Let them ask their questions. I'm not afraid anymore. For 6 months I've been carrying this weight, this anger, this grief, thinking that no one cared, thinking that Jamie's death would just be forgotten, swept under the rug like it didn't matter. But you proved me wrong. You proved that someone does care, that justice is still possible." David stood up, preparing to leave. He had to get back to his office, prepare for the press conference, coordinate with the FBI and state police. But before he left, he turned back to Catherine. "Your son would be proud of you. The way you fought for him. The way you never gave up even when everyone else did. That takes real courage." "He would have liked you too," Catherine said, smiling through her tears. "I was right about that. Jamie had a sense about people, and he would have known you were someone who gives a damn." The press conference that afternoon was packed. Reporters from every major outlet, cameras everywhere, questions shouted from all directions. David stood at the podium and told the truth. He explained how a young musician named Jamie Porter had been killed by a drunk driver who fled the scene. How a sitting judge had used his influence to protect his nephew and bury the investigation. How good police officers had been ordered to stop pursuing justice. He didn't mention meeting Catherine in the diner. He didn't make it about himself or turn it into some kind of hero story. He kept the focus where it belonged, on Jamie and on the systemic failures that had allowed his death to go unpunished for 6 months. But at the end, when a reporter asked what had prompted him to personally get involved in a cold case, David allowed himself one personal moment. He pulled Catherine's card from his wallet and held it up. "Someone once told me that these aren't just cases or files or statistics. They're people with families who love them. She asked me to remember that. So I did." Later that week, formal charges were filed. Brett Morris was charged with vehicular manslaughter, hit and run resulting in death, and driving under the influence. Judge Thomas Morris was charged with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Carlson's testimony, combined with the physical evidence and witness statements, painted a clear picture of what had happened. David kept Catherine informed every step of the way. He visited her twice more, bringing updates on the case and answering her questions. They weren't strangers anymore. They were two people connected by a shared mission, by a commitment to making sure Jamie's death meant something. And in his wallet, next to his driver's license and credit cards, David kept Catherine's card. A reminder that behind every case, every file, every legal proceeding, there were real people with real pain. A reminder that power without compassion was meaningless. A reminder that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply listen and then choose to act.